All right, we're ready to go.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you doing, guys? That's good to hear. That's good to hear. So we have two simple rules, guys. Mass are on all the time. And the second thing is, if you have any questions, please post them on the application on MAS-ICNA. There's no going to be papers being sent and then we're going to collect them. Everything has to be on the application. Okay. So if you can download it, go to the specific session, and from there I will receive questions and propose them to our speakers. We have two speakers, alhamdulillah, Margari Hill and then Sarsour. So we're going to start with Margari Hill. I'll give us a brief introduction, and then she will go on for 15 minutes, and then we'll have Sister Sarsour. She will have 15 minutes, and then we will proceed, inshallah, for the question and answers. A simple introduction to the session. It's called Tools of Abuse, Race and Power. Critical race theory provides us an opportunity to organize for justice from a place of intentionality. Using lessons learned from the Quran, Seerah, and current successful political movements, we will explore tools of oppression and how race and power play a role in our political reality today. A brief introduction of Margari Hill. Margari Aziza Hill is an adjunct professor, blogger, editor, and a freelancer writer with articles published in Sisters, Islamic Monthly, and Spice Digest. She's the co-founder of executive director of Muslim ARC, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, an organization focusing on education for liberation. After converting to Islam in 1993, her life experience as a Black American woman have informed her research and writing on Islam, education, race, and gender. She has nearly a decade of teaching experience at levels from elementary, secondary, college, to adult education. She earned her master's in history of Middle East and Islamic Africa from Stanford University in 2006. Her research includes colonial perception, mixed race identities in North Nigerian, anti-colonial resistance among West Africans in Sudan during the early 20th century, transformation in Islamic learning in Northern Nigeria, and international student programs at Al-Azhar and Cairo University. Please welcome her to the stage. Thank you.
So I don't know if there's any Nigerians in the room.
Nigeria in the house.
So Nigeria is the most populous Muslim country in Africa. They outpace Egypt, and so it's really exciting for me as a scholar of student of scholarship in Northern Nigeria, but also the first Miss Nigeria Muhajiba just won. So I'm really excited. So So yeah, and we have a session to talk about anti-Blackness, and so I'm really excited tomorrow. So come learn about the history. Yeah, so I'm going to start. I'm going to do a little bit of the historical stuff. As you know from my biography, I'm a historian, but I'm also an educator. I feel a little bit like I have a little handicap because I don't have my PowerPoint. I love PowerPoints, but I'll try to keep it interesting. So. At the roots, right, of our faith is addressing oppression. We have so many hadith. We can also, I know many of you know them by heart. You learned them in weekend school. You've heard them in many lectures. And sometimes, we have these values. We talk about Islam as an anti-racism, as an anti-oppression religion, right? And so I'm going to talk about the basis, but also to explore why is there a separation between our values and sometimes the outcomes that we may have. So I'll talk about that a little bit, but really focusing on the efforts that Muslims have done in addressing that. The second part that I want to talk about is really the kind of the roots of white supremacy and why, regardless of our race as Muslims, why it behooves us. It is an absolute imperative that we dismantle the global white supremacy. So first, going back to 7th century Arabia, right, there was so much inequality. There was also tribalism, and there were like the xenophobia and the targeting of Black people in Arabia. And there was many different types of Black identities. And so there's not necessarily this distinction between a Black person and an Arab, because there were also very famous Arabs that were Black, and that didn't necessarily face being targeted because of that. But there were also people that were targeted because of that. And so you have like the stories like Bilal. And I'm not going to go all the way in depth of that, but really when we think about that time, that there were so many cases within the Sira that address the ways that people talked about one another, which exemplifies some of the consciousness around class, tribal differences, around gender, right? We know Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, his mission was not just for us to go pray 50 times a day, right? He had 5 times a day. Why? So we could do a lot of things to better the world and take care of our families and our neighbors. And so, and part of that mission, right, was not just securing the position of his tribe. He had to actually go and stand up for his people. And that's where we have like the ayat is like standing for justice, even if against your own kin. And that was very difficult during that time, right, of standing up against your own, whether your kinfolk were powerful or weak, because that was your social network. And so some of the ayat that I feel like we really need to kind of explore in more depth, like we're created of different tribes and nations so we may know one another. But some of this one ayat that I found in just a little bit earlier on Surah Al-Hujurat 11, and where Allah tells us, "O believers, do not let some men ridicule others. They may be better than them, nor let some women ridicule other women. They may be better than them. Do not defame one another, nor call each other by offensive nicknames. How evil it is to act rebelliously after having faith. And whoever does not repent, it is those who are true wrongdoers." Now I wanted to kind of highlight that because in a lot of ways, like the jokes that we have, and I know people have all sorts of critiques around PC. Back in the 80s, it was political correct culture, but now we call it cancel culture. It's this idea that, okay, it's okay to say these kinds of jokes, but really what it does is normalizes certain things like ideas that target marginalized groups. And typically the jokes are really targeting people who are poor, they're targeting women, they're targeting people of color, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, Arabs, South Asians, of all types, right? And so we live in a society, like we've been absorbing all of the dominant narratives of the society. Now going back to the kind of structures of how do we define who is the dominant class in society, and what are the roots of white supremacy, right? It's like, one, when we talk about systemic oppression and white supremacy, we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about culture, dominant narratives, one, how the dominant group talks about itself, how it talks about other people, right? And the way that it talks about itself and other people justifies the mistreatment of those people. And we saw that in the 7th century Arabia, right? And we see that now. But really what we have is like a much more powerful system that is global. Now, in the 15th century, you had where Muslims themselves were very politically powerful. I know all of us come from some type of, we've either been colonized, right? We've dealt with continual warfare, or we have been trafficked. Our ancestors have been trafficked. Like my ancestors were kidnapped and trafficked as human people and forced and their unpaid labor for 400 years. Now all of us have been impacted by white supremacy in some type of way. And the roots of that, that's not in all, like, it didn't have to necessarily be that way. It wasn't historically like a given that Europeans would dominate the whole world, but there was a moment in history that you can see where there was a convergence and a justification for the treatment of indigenous peoples in the Americas, for the continual war against Muslims, and for the enslavement of Africans. And around that time was during the Reconquista, of when the Pope had allowed King Alfonso of Portugal to say like, hey, we'll let you enslave Africans, declare war against the unbelievers, the enemies of Christ, and the pagans, and as long as you support us. And part of that was like this competition that they had with Muslims, but also reclaiming what they saw as their natural land. Why do I kind of point to this moment in history? Because even the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she actually used the same doctrine of discovery to justify the continual holding on to indigenous lands. So the doctrine of discovery is not just a historical document. This moment in time really allowed for the conquest of the Americas, the genocide against indigenous peoples, enslavement, and continual war against Muslims. And we still experience this today. Now, why does this matter? Because this is an intersectional moment that should be grounding our solidarity. This is a moment where Europeans started to say, we are one group and everybody else is other. Now, and it was justified through religion, through culture, and the idea and skin color. Because the ways that they described Muslims was not by religion, right? They didn't say, oh, those Muslims. They either called Muslims Saracens, which was a tribe who was they considered Muslims all swarthy people, right? Or they saw them as black. So, and typically the Moors who were Muslims, they were still framed as black. So if you watch Shakespeare, you'll see they'll do blackface for all the Moors. So they're described as Moors, Turks, or Saracens. And so Muslims have always been racialized. But at the core of these atrocities was anti-Muslim racism, right? And so for us, if we are going to dismantle the things that oppress us globally, it behooves us, we have to address the other people who are targeted, the indigenous peoples, the Latino brothers and sisters who are also targeted by similar policies under the war on drugs and trying to close up the borders and criminalizing migration, right? And we also have to address anti-Black racism. There's an article that talks about the fulcrum of white supremacy. And they say at the roots of it is anti-Blackness. And at that core of the Dum Diversis, which is the doctrine of discovery, you'll see that the systems that are in place were predicated upon the enslavement of Africans. So for us Muslims to get free, we have to dismantle the whole systems that oppress us. Let's everybody doing that
work. I'm from Brooklyn, so you're gonna give it up one more time for Dr. Margari Hill and me. I'm very honored to be on this stage with Dr. Margari, and I need you all to follow the work of Muslim Arc. They are on social media. They have a lot of resources, particularly those of you who are involved in Muslim student associations or doing any work around anti-racism, whether it be in your company or your corporation. They have built these resources for our community, so there's no need to reinvent the wheel, there's no need to crowdsource, there's no need to go Google. They exist, and it comes from a very Muslim perspective, so it helps it be relevant to our community. So please use Muslim Arc as a resource. You know, a lot of people see me as an activist and organizer and see me in the larger kind of racial justice movements and probably think that I always know what I'm talking about and that I always know what I'm doing. And that's actually far from the truth. And it's been great to be around sisters like Dr. Margari, like Dr. Camila Rashad and others to better and evolve myself as a Palestinian American, Arab American, and as a light-skinned Arab. And the reason why skin color is important in this conversation, I gotta stand because I'm not a sitter. She's a professor, I'm not, I'm an organizer. My legs start twitching if I'm sitting down talking. You know, for me, being able to learn and evolve in being a better activist and a better organizer, especially amongst our Muslim American community. And I think something that Dr. Marjorie was saying that's really important is that sometimes being conscious of some of the things that we say. And let me give you an example of something that I used to say before. And I actually had said it before years ago at MAS, and I said it at ICNA and ISNA, a lot of places. I used to say that it's important for our Muslim American community to build solidarity with African American communities. I used to say that. And my intention in saying that was to build solidarity with African American communities who are not Muslim. But if you're an African or an African American sitting in a space with me, you're probably thinking to yourself, what is this lady talking about? Because when you say Muslim American communities building with African American communities, you're not including me in the Muslim part and making me either feel like I may not be part of the African American part of what you're saying, but I'm also not included in the Muslim part. And it was because of conversations with people like Dr. Marjorie and others, making me even be more conscious of the way in which I am talking and embracing this kind of language and lexicon around racial justice is really important. So the point here is that we're always evolving, we're always learning, and we're always going to make mistakes, and it's important for us to hear from fellow folks in our community about how some of the things we say make other people feel. And so this is not about we're outright anti-Black, right? That's not the conversation. The conversation is how do we show up in spaces? How do we show up in our community as we are living in a country that is in turmoil when it comes to race and racism, and specifically around anti-Black racism. The one thing that I will say also to Muslims in the room, whether you are Black, whether you are Arab, whether you are South Asian, Southeast Asian, whether you are a white convert, whether you are an Eastern European Muslim, it doesn't actually matter. In this country, in America, you are a racialized group of people. So you're, in the eyes of the American public, regardless of your skin color, you are a Muslim. And because of the fact that you are a Muslim, we all got lumped into one group. And because of us being lumped into one group, we are now having to be directly impacted by policies from this government against us as Muslims in America, and also, of course, against our fellow sisters and brothers in other parts of the world. The important thing about when we think about race, right, and racism, there's a difference between racism and bigotry, right? Bigotry exists amongst all communities, right? There can be bigotry amongst each other. There can be, different ways in which different groups stereotype each other and things like that. Race is a very important concept that we have to understand in the Muslim community. Race is bigotry plus power. Race is bigotry plus power. So when people say so for example, when people say Black people can't be racist, Black people could be bigots. They can be, it's possible. But they can't be racist because in America, Black people don't have power. They could be racist, they could be bigoted against you, they could be anti-Arab, they could be anti-anything, but they don't have power to use that bigotry to oppress you and impact your life in any way. Now, they might hurt your feelings. Your feelings will be hurt, but they actually don't have power. And that's the important thing that we have to realize also how we operate in the Muslim American community. That once we understand that racism is bigotry plus power. So is that clear? Everybody's gonna leave here. Racism is bigotry plus power. That is why there's no such thing as reverse race. No white people can tell me that Black people are racist against white people. It's just not possible. It's absolutely, there's no way around that. Can Black people and Arab be bigoted against another group of people? Absolutely. And that's an important distinction that when we have a conversation, particularly in a country like the United States of America. Now, to Dr. Marjorie's point, colonialism is what taught us to be racist in other parts of the world, okay? Like, for example, I go to Morocco, right? I went to Morocco, and I love Morocco. Any Moroccans in the house? Oh, she's like, Morocco in the house? Okay, so I went to Morocco, and Morocco is a country in the continent of Africa, right? In Morocco, I saw light-skinned Arab. I saw people who had the darkest skin that you've ever seen. But in Morocco, they don't have the same concept as race. They don't have Black and not Black. That's just not how they operate in a place like Morocco. So it's very interesting for them to understand this whole thing around the way in which we racialize people. So in Morocco, the way that their system is going to work, it's going to be based on socioeconomic status, right? It's based on people, how they live, where they live, in the village, not in the village, based on education, based on socioeconomic status. And for the times that they do experience some of this kind of racialized language or even, you know, bigotry amongst each other, is because they learned that from France and they learned that from colonialists, right? We don't have these concepts. Like, you don't go to Palestine and they say African Palestinian, or in the same context in which we use that here in the United States of America. So unfortunately, this country and its Western allies have taught this idea of racism around the world. Now, what do we have in the Muslim community amongst some of our groups, right? So if you're South Asian, for example, we have to always, this is a family conversation, that's why we close the doors, all this conversation between us. Colorism, that's a concept that we have, that unfortunately we have to figure out how to deal with. So nobody here deny that you live in a society and sometimes in a community where people talk about, for example, in the context of marriage, right? Talk about how light-skinned your new daughter-in-law is gonna be, right? Or people talk about colorism, and even within some of the different groups that we're in, whether we're Arab or South Asians, the way in which we even classify different groups of people, right? So like when you look at Indians and the Pakistanis over here, and then we start going down the list, and then the caste system goes down, then the Bangladeshis, and then you got the Sri Lankans. All this is something that we have to grapple with in our community. This is just a fact of the matter that we have to be able to operate in the Muslim community. We also in the Muslim community have learned segregation from the origins of this land. Now notice this, and tell me if I'm crazy, because I've seen it with my own eyes. People will say, oh, Sister Linda, I go to the Arab mosque in downtown Chicago. I go to the Indo-Pakistani mosque, right, in Hamtramck in Michigan, right? Our mosques have now somehow figured out how to be segregated based on race or based on ethnicity. That's what it is. And the question for us is why? How did that happen? Where did that come from, right? And what are the things that we're gonna do as a new generation to try to break the cycle of what is in fact contrary to our deen? That's just the bottom line. We're actually veering off of deen versus, right? Being more centered at a time like now to figure out how to integrate and go back to the origins of who we are as a people and as a Muslim community. And when we do that, because we're worried about everybody's Islamophobic and everybody's doing this and that, let's not worry about everybody else. Let's clean up our house first. Let's become an example to the rest of the country that we are the most racially and ethnically diverse faith community in the entire United States of America. And if we can figure it out, if we can figure out how to combat anti-Black racism within the Muslim community, sexism within the Muslim community, if we can figure out how to, equalize across the board so we don't have Muslims in our community who are literally struggling and under the poverty level and can barely feed their families. If we can figure out in our Muslim community how to integrate refugees, where refugees have just been torn from their homes and they come to America and say, this is my people right here. This is my people. I came to my people opened their doors and gave me a second chance after my country was torn away. This is the kind of things that we have to learn how to organize around in our Muslim American communities. We live in a country, and one of the descriptions that you saw in the actual act was talking about critical race theory. And we hear these terms in this country, and of course everybody comes up with smart things, and everyone's like, we don't know what's going on. It's very simple, sisters and brothers. In order for us to, people say, oh, I want to change the world, and I'm committed to racial justice, and I'm committed to gender justice, and I'm committed to doing all these things. Well, you can't get there if you don't learn about all the horrific mistakes that we have made, especially in this country, in order for us to do better. You gotta learn history so that you don't repeat the history. And so what is happening in America right now, this is very dangerous. I'm telling you, like we gotta wake up as a Muslim community. It's very dangerous. In America, there are people with power. Let's remember that racism is bigotry plus power. There are people who are racist and powerful in America who are saying, we are going to alter the curriculums of the United States of America. We are going to take out what we believe is harmful to our narrative to mostly what are
white folks, right? White, powerful men in America who have been in power since the origins and foundings of this nation, who are noticing that when people are educated, when people understand the history of America, they say, oh, I don't want to be part of that. Oh, I didn't know that that's how that happened. Oh, I want to forge a new path. Even their own young people, new generations, are like, wait a minute, was my grandfather a slave owner? I don't want nothing to do with that. I want to be different. So they want to basically, what they're trying to do is take away the history, sometimes the dark, brutal history of this country, so our kids don't learn about it, and somehow find a way to be so prideful in this American project, American dream, and not be able to think about what are the things that we're going to do better moving forward. And they're doing the same thing about things that include us as Muslims. There are laws across the country that are sitting on somebody's desk right now, and we call them anti-Sharia bills. These are people who are trying to figure out how to limit our rights as Muslims to practice our religion freely. And we as Muslims are almost sometimes the last people to know that that's happening. And when we do know that it's happening, we don't even know what to do about it. Which is why I'm an organizer. Because the last thing that I'm going to allow anybody to do, at least, and listen, I can't change the world. I'm only one person. But I know I'm going to die trying. I know that when generations of Muslims to come, they're going to say, look, Sister Linda was doing something. I don't know, she didn't win. We didn't really move much, but there were people that were fighting. And I come to conferences like MAS-ICNA because I'm trying to figure out how to build the army. Where are you in the country? Pennsylvania, Indiana, Michigan, Chicago, New Mexico, California. In every place in America, we need always a determined few in our Muslim community that say, you know what, number one, I'm going to be different. And I will say this about our parents too and our grandparents. I'm a daughter of immigrants. How many people here are either children or grandchildren of immigrants? A lot of folks, right? My approach to having these hard conversations about race in our community, about colorism in our community, about patriarchy and sexism in our community is that I don't have no ill will towards my parents and my grandparents and elders in our community, people who've come to this country. You know why? Because they've learned centuries of patriarchy. This is what they know. This is what they know. It's passed down from generation to generation to generation. So I'm not going to judge my grandparents. I'm not going to judge my parents. What I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out how to take them on another journey. I'm going to say, you've gotten this far. Now as a young person, and I'm not that young, but I'm still going to say I'm a young person. My job is, I'm going to take you on, I got it, like as they say in Brooklyn, I got it from here. Whoever brought you this far, thank you to them, but I got you from here. So all of you have a responsibility also to do what we call, you know when we tell the white folks, get your cousins? We all got cousins we gotta get. Everybody got a cousin. Sometimes your cousin's your father, or your mother, or your sister, or your brother-in-law. Sometimes we have to be courageous when we hear something that's happening around us and say, hold on a second here. Let's have a conversation about that. And unfortunately, and Sister Marjorie knows this because we've debated people online about this all the time, sometimes, I'll give you an example. An unarmed black man gets killed in Ferguson, Missouri. Do you guys remember that story of Mike Brown? I defriended about, I'm not exaggerating, about 600 Muslims that frame time. So a 17-year-old boy goes into a grocery store or whatever, liquor store, whatever he does in there, comes out of the grocery store, walking down the street. A police officer, Darren Wilson, sees Mike Brown. Mike Brown is shot down to the ground, right? So he's laying on the streets in the middle of Ferguson, Missouri. He lays down on the ground for 4 hours. Nobody ever said, let me check if this young man has a pulse. Let me go call an ambulance to see if this young man's still alive, whether we can resuscitate him. Then after the 4 hours, now mind you, it's August when this happens. Swimming in his blood, you know, August is a hot month. And now here you are, shot to death, your blood's spilling out of your body. It's 85, 90 degrees. Then what happens after that? A SUV comes, pick up Mike Brown off the ground, roll him up, throw him in the back of an SUV. This is what happened in Ferguson, Missouri. So here comes some of the Muslims online. But what did he do before he got shot? Sister Linda, why don't you tell the whole story? What story? Let's just say for the purposes of this conversation, I'm giving you an example because this happens unfortunately 3 times a week in the United States. Let's just say for the purposes of this conversation that Mike Brown stole some cigarillos from the liquor store. Let's say that's what he did. There's never been any proof of evidence of that. There's videos, he didn't do that, but let's just say for the purposes of what kind of Muslim are you that tells me you want to know if a young man shoplifted some cigarillos and you as a Muslim are asking me that murder justifies whatever you think that he did? That was what the Muslims were talking about online. This is the debate that I was having with the Muslims. This is what we talk about in the Muslim community. We're always trying, and guess what? That's exactly what white supremacists do. And that's the internalization of the ways in which we are so quick to side with power. So here's another thing Muslims love to say, and I'm generalizing, by the way, just so we're all clear. Muslims will say, Sister Linda, I read the police report. And the police report is not what the witnesses say it was. Oh, so here comes the Muslims telling me that they believe the cops. Great job, Muslims. Great job. I'm so proud of you all. Sisters and brothers, that's why history is important. There is a woman named Ida B. Wells. She was an investigative reporter and a very important figure at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. She said something that always sticks with me every time there's a police shooting in America. And this is what she said. She said, and I want you to, it's a very simple sentence and something very easy to remember. Anytime a police shooting happens in America. She said, those who commit the murders are the ones who write the reports. Those who commit the murders are the ones who write the reports. So you're telling me that a cop who just shot a little boy to the ground, like Tamir Rice, you're telling me you read the police report. So you don't think a murderer is going to write a report that's actually going to be in his own best interest or in his favor? So please, Muslims, do not ever debate anyone online and tell me that you read the police report. There are Muslims in America, based on the fact that they are just Muslims, are languishing in prisons in America, in what we call Guantanamo North, which are literally Guantanamo-style maximum security prisons for, believe it or not, things they don't know why they're in there, because the United States government came up with some new stuff for the Muslims. It's called convicted by secret evidence. Did you know that? Virtue of who we are, that we can sit and languish. Somebody could come and drag me out of here right now, put me in a prison somewhere, tell me I don't have access to my family, I can't talk to no one, I gotta only choose one person, I can only see my lawyer for 1 hour a month. Why? I don't know, because the government says if they tell me it's a breach of national security. This is the kind of country that we live in, and this is why these conversations are really important for us to have as we start understanding ourselves and our own identity. Now, the important thing is for us to figure out how do we see ourselves as a community. And I'm going to tell you why. We have had an increase in harassment of Muslim women just in the last few weeks. Every day, go online, go on that Muslim Instagram page. Every day there's a new story. Sister got assaulted, sister got her hijab pulled off, sister on a college campus, sister on a sister in middle school, sister in second grade. I mean, every day there's a story. And I always say this, and I say this about the Islamophobes because there's always something to learn from the opposition. There's always something to learn from the opposition. The opposition, when they attack our masajid, for example, there's a vandalism at a masjid, right? Or they attack a Muslim sister in hijab. You think that the Islamophobe is smart enough to know what madhab that masjid was? Do you think they look up who the imam is and say, oh, I know where this imam studied. I know what kind, I don't know, they trust me when I tell you, they don't even know if the masjid is Sunni, Shia, Sufis, they know none of that. You think when they stop a Muslim sister to harass her, you think they tap her on the shoulder and say, excuse me, sister, are you Lebanese, Syrian, or Jordanian? Are you Indo-Pakistani, or where are you? They don't care. So I always say to people, if the Islamophobes treat us like we're one community, when are we gonna start acting like we're one community, right? That's my. The only way that we can be impacted and targeted by opposition is when they see cracks in our community, right? Because it's easier to break something that is already broken, right? But you can't break something that is already together, that people that have figured out how to build true solidarity within our own community. And I'm gonna end by saying this, and then we can get into some question and answer. And actually, I'm gonna alter what the brother said a little bit. Since it's not a really big room, I'm gonna allow people to stand up and ask your question, and just keep it kind of short, just to give other people a space to speak as well. The other thing that is really important for us as Muslims, as we think about these conversations around race and really internalize and really understand how we could evolve and be a better community, is also understanding our own story as Muslims, right? A lot of times Muslims think, and it's fine because this is just how we grew up. We think that Islam came to America when like our Pakistani grandfather came here to go to medical school, right? Or when like your Lebanese grandfather came after the Civil War or something. Like everybody has a moment in time that they associate kind of their family lineage and heritage. It's not about your family heritage. When your Pakistani grandfather came here to go to medical school, he didn't just come out in an airplane and say, oh, assalamu alaikum, and he was like the first Muslim who got here. There were people that came before your Pakistani grandfather, and before your Palestinian grandfather, and before your Syrian grandfather, and before your Nigerian grandfather. There have been people that have toiled on this land way before any of our people ever got here that allowed us to be who we are today. And although I am not African American and I'm not African myself, I also know my lineage as a Muslim. And all of you have to embrace this story, that we as Muslims can trace our lineage back to before the founding of these United States of America, right? We can trace our lineage back to Moors who were explorers who came here before there was ever a United States of America. We could trace our lineage back to enslaved Africans. And one thing I recommend for you all to watch is there is a documentary called Prince of Slaves, A Prince Among Slaves. 25 to 30% of enslaved African people were Muslims. And guess what? In West African continent, people thought these people were some primitive people. These were some of the most educated scholars. They were royalty. This documentary is formed around one man named Abdurrahman. He was a prince. He was a military general. He was he spoke more than 3 languages. And he became an enslaved person. In fact, married another enslaved black woman and had 9 children under the watch of a slave master. And when he was 67 years old, he went back to Africa. And the reason why understanding that history is because as we talk about Islamophobia and how Muslims were always the victims, poor us, sisters and brothers, you are not experiencing anything near what a black enslaved African had to experience under the watch of a white slave master in America, okay? You don't know what it means to be rooted from your entire life, your land, your property, your family, your heritage, your traditions, your everything that you have, to come and be forced into labor in these United States of America. And what was beautiful about our story that gave me so much, this is why I have courage. I don't let nobody tell me anything. Because you know why? My lineage is connected to people who figured out how to be Muslim under the watches of white slave masters. People who figured out how to pray because they watched the sun rise and the sun set. They figured out when Ramadan was based on the seasons as they were turning. They may not have been accurate, sisters and brothers, but you better believe Allah was accepting from people who had nothing and figured out how to keep their iman in their heart as there were forced conversions that were happening amongst enslaved people. That's your story. That's your heritage. That's your lineage as a Muslim. So when somebody tells you go back to your country, you tell them this is my country. My people built this country on their backs. And that is why in this country, when I say to people, be unapologetically Muslim, I'm not trying to be cool, sisters and brothers. It's not a little mantra that I have. I am unapologetically Muslim. You have to be unapologetically Muslim because somebody sacrificed for you to sit in that seat here at MAS-ICNA. And you have a responsibility to our young people to walk with your back straight once you leave this MAS-ICNA. Whether in your college campus, whether in your corporation, whether you're just walking at the mall. This is the responsibility that we have to those who came before us. So I expect us all to leave here saying, I'm gonna do better. I'm going to be better. I'm going to educate myself, and I'm going to ensure that I'm going to participate in making our community truly the best community there is on this earth. Assalamu alaikum.
I appreciate all of this, and thank you for the enlightenment too, me too, and I hope everybody's enlightened and with a new perspective to do, inshallah, for the future for us and our kids and our community, inshallah. There are a little bit of questions here, so I think after that we will give the questions outside. Okay? So I'm just gonna say the question, and I'm gonna tell you which one we choose to say. Okay, so can you please share some words on how each and every single one of us can create awareness with our Arab community families with anti-Black racism?
I guess first you have to start with yourself, right? You need to have the anti-racism awareness. I think it's more important you don't just just go online and just call out your family members, especially if you haven't done that work yourself, right? In the subtle ways of that we've internalized racism. There's a lot of healing work that we have to do as individuals, right? Of what we've internalized. So when you do that kind of healing and trauma work, that transformative work, and you kind of know like how you can, and learning how to communicate in a prophetic way, right, and compassion. And that was something, I mean, when we started out, I mean, we made a lot of mistakes doing this work. Like burning bridges even, like, because we kind of didn't understand the principles of compassionate communication, of when to talk to someone and how to address them. And a lot of that work was also like shaming. It's easy to point fingers, right? If you're telling somebody, oh, you're wrong, but if it's like, if you tell somebody like, you know what, I used to think like you, like that. Like when you actually call somebody in with the shared commonality, and it's like, well, I used to think like you about that issue, but then I learned this thing. And so maybe we need to reconsider, and understanding there's an ongoing conversation that one needs to have. And so this year, I know for us, with our fellows, with Muslim Arts Fellows, we're going to be working on programming specifically around bystander intervention. There's multiple techniques that one can do, but I mean, it's definitely outside of the scope of us talking here. And if you like, I mean, please do follow up with us so that we can do that bystander work. We have like Ramadan anti-racism campaigns, and in that is like having a workshop and how to do those interventions, and do it in a way, because I mean, one, we're supposed to use the best of speech, right? And even, the idea of, enjoining the right and forbidding the wrong. Well, when you look at even the scholarship around it and the techniques, right? There's certain people like we kind of tend to focus on. A lot of it is like in this society, we're focusing on this interpersonal stuff and calling each other out for like offensive stuff, but not calling each other out on like things that actually hurt lifespans of people and life outcomes, but justifying things that are actually like atrocities, right, that we can actually intervene. And so I do think like while we do need to work on our families, really we need to really work on our families of dismantling justifications for the dehumanization, the genocide against other people, while saying like, well, those people deserve it because they're backwards, but then yet our people should be free, right? I mean, there's all these kind of things that are happening, and I think that we need to really focus a lot on educating together and learning together, having that conversation, and recognizing we didn't always think the way that we do, right? And so like when you're calling in, don't look down upon people that have been taught this, recognizing that much of that is white supremacy, those narratives that they learned from somewhere else. And you could be like, where did you get that? I thought that too, but then I learned that what I was taught was wrong. So at least start with compassion. But I would say more so like start with compassion and begin the learning journey yourself. It takes some investment in time and everything, but believe me, I mean, for me, it's like going into some of the anti-racism trainings have been healing, but start with yourself, healing yourself from white supremacy, healing yourself from all the racism that you've internalized from literature, TV, the things that you've seen on the street, all the things, like when you're looking at the disparities, whether it's like housing and everything, all that stuff is racialized. And we have to be able to unpack that. So yeah, I know we want to, and then once you start with yourself, then we can start with our families, but but still be gentle, recognizing that they're all facing trauma. They've all been colonized, and they're not the ones that really hold the power. Are they like running billions of dollars and just, no, they're just your parents who are trying to figure it out too. So really, like, a lot of our energy, we really have to focus more on systems and like a little bit less time of focusing all our energy on offensive things, but looking at like atrocities that are happening right in front of us.
Okay, so somebody asked what is the definition of a bigot, so if you can give a brief the definition of that. And is there a difference between racism in Islamic circles and racism in the American context? And how would Muslims develop ways to solve racism in Muslim context?
Did you want to define bigot?
I mean, so bigotry is prejudice. Bigotry is just like, I don't like you because of where you're from, or I'm prejudiced against your hair color, your skin color, where you're from, where do you live, right? So it's kind of someone who sees you of lesser value or lesser, of a lesser person based on some attribute that you hold. But again, if the person doesn't have power over you, then it's not racism, right? Does that make sense? So that's why bigotry is just basically like, you know, there are people who are bigots. Like I said, like Arab could be bigoted. Arab, actually, that's not a good example because Arab in many parts of the world actually hold power, right? So that's not a good example. But let's say, you know, a Indian against a Sri Lankan. Sometimes there's some prejudice there, but there's not in fact much power dynamics, especially not in the context of the United States of America. What was the second part of the question?
The second was, is there a difference between racism in Islamic circles and racism in the American context?
So racism in the American context is systematic, right? And it actually stops you from like certain kinds of opportunities, but believe it or not, that actually gets manifested in Islamic spaces as well. And that means the way you're treated when you walk into a masjid, for example, right? Especially if you are not part of the dominant culture or race of that masjid. It's also about the opportunities. There were for many years, if you've noticed, at many conferences, Islamic conferences, we hardly saw Black women who were on the stages. That's just, right? I don't believe that somebody was sitting in a room being like, we have to make sure Black women don't speak. It was, again, some sort of learned kind of expectation or erasure, really, of Black, brilliant scholars, activists, organizers within the Muslim community. And it took a lot of conversations and people actually networking and meeting each other and saying, wait a minute, Dr. Margari is out here doing some important things. So she'd come into the convention, right? Sister Aisha Prime, you know, Dr. Kamila Rashad, right? Sister Zainab Ansari, making sure that we are actually centering also voices in our community. So, because you can't be outside, sisters and brothers, saying Black Lives Matter, and then you come to the MAS convention and Black lives don't matter here. It's not gonna work, right? And that really was a turning point, I think, for the Muslim community, particularly around 2014, where the Muslim community had kind of their own kind of shock factor and realized that we needed to invite more and center more Black voices. And in fact, starting to see an increase in the number of African and African American participation within MAS and ICNA conventions and others, because they used to be really like 5 people. And alhamdulillah, we have started to see much more, and in hopes that the reason why, and I'm sure there is much more work to be done, I'm hoping that the reason why there's been an increase is that a lot of our African and African American sisters and brothers are starting to see more relevant conversations, starting to kind of feel more well respected and embraced in these spaces. And I'm sure that we all have more work to do, but I'm hoping that back to the original concept, the evolution. And I'll just say one really quick thing. Sister Margari talked about not being bystanders. So you all know I wrote a book. I have no shame these days. I learned that you write books, and Dr. Margari writes books too, so gotta tell you about the books. I wrote a book called We Are Not Here to Be Bystanders. And it's an important book to me because it was a story and a kind of a narrative form. So it's not some boring academic book where I'm gonna start taking you through definitions and it's like, I'm gonna take you away from that. It's a story that takes you through what it means to not be a bystander. What is our role as individual Muslims organizing in the Muslim community? What it means not to have to be extraordinary, that you don't have to have a degree in organizing. I don't have a degree in activism and organizing, to be clear. And so, for the sisters in the room, I just wanted to make this announcement before we wrap it up in a couple of minutes, that tomorrow at 3:30, this is only for the sisters, I'll get to the brothers in a second. 3:30 in room S106, which is the room down the hall from here, there's gonna be a sisters only session, okay? No brothers are not allowed in the session. No brothers are, just kidding. It's not that serious, bro. It's a sister, it's important sometimes for us as sisters to be in space together, to have a really important conversation about us as women and girls in the community, what our role is, what our experiences are, and kind of having a safe place to have that conversation. And then after that, I'm gonna be doing a book signing outside of 106 at about 4:30, 4:15 when the session ends. And that is when the brothers are welcome back, because you could also buy a book, see? I don't discriminate. You just can't come to the session, but you could come outside the session and get your book signed as well. So tomorrow, 3:30, S106, I would love to, and if there are sisters here that are not here, it's a much bigger room. I would love to get as many sisters as possible in that room, because I think that there's a conversation that we haven't had amongst us as women, and as we're trying to kind of participate and build in our MSAs, in our community, in our organizations, and even within our families, that we're kind of beating around the bush. Mental health, self-care, how do we show up? And I hope that you tell other sisters tomorrow, 3:30, room S106.
My apologies, I know we would like to have more questions and everything, but we're over the time by 10 minutes, so I hope you also attend her book signing and her other session. Thank you very much. I hope you just get ready for the next session, inshallah, at 3:30.